Francesco Rizzuto. He joins us from Manchester in the UK, and he's a professor of law at the University of East London. Professor, it's always good to speak to you. You know, when we look at these tariffs and this relationship right now between the US and the EU, it's always been a close relationship. But since the Trump administration came into power, they've been openly critical of the EU. Some would say insulting in many ways. Now with these tariffs, possibly more tariffs, how does that affect the relationship between these long-standing allies?
Good afternoon. Well, I think that the relationship is in crisis. Trust between the European Union and its key member states and the Trump administration has basically broken down. Obviously, the Europeans and the key states, excluding Italy, have avoided insulting Trump. But there's no doubt that the penny has dropped in Europe. Mr. Trump is no friend of the European Union, and that we need to basically give ourselves the means, sensibly, to ensure that we become, if not independent, certainly far more autonomous than we have been vis-a-vis the Trump administration and presumably the administration that will follow Trump. Though, of course, many in Europe are hoping that the American Congress and the American courts will stop Trump in this, basically war, trade war, he's declared on the rest of the world.
How does Europe start to become more autonomous, though? Because it does feel like Donald Trump is forcing so many countries to become more autonomous, as you say, but also to look to other partners, because there are also fears that Europe will turn more to China, and as we heard from our reporter, of an influx of cheap Chinese goods. However, you could see that for many countries around the world, if they try to move away from the United States.
Absolutely. I think that Europe has... Look, Trump wants to divide the European Union, and that would be his dream. And this is one way of doing that, knowing that there are diverging interests. But he forgets that actually, thanks to the single market, the 27 member states are dependent on each other to a very great extent. So it's not so easy to tear the European Union apart economically, nor will those diverging interests mean that they won't come to an agreement, because the member states and the European Union realize that whilst America is important, so is everybody else in Europe. So it's not that easy to disentangle it. On the question of China, yes, a closer relationship with China and other parts of the world, for example, Central Asia. So Europe can diversify its markets, though it has to complete its internal market along the Draghi agenda. And that is very important. I do think that Europe does have the means to limit, to stop a flood of Chinese cheap goods coming into Europe. You know, we have under the WTO, even though that's a bit of a red herring, frankly, because the Americans killed that under the first Trump administration. But we can stop that through safeguard measures, anti-dumping charges, and so on. So that isn't a preoccupation. Obviously, the European Union can strengthen its relationship with China. But the European Union needs to avoid the situation that the United States have got itself in with China, where we become overly dependent on Chinese manufactured goods and we destroy our own manufacturing base, such as it is.
Donald Trump has responded to the latest tariffs from China. They've just imposed 84% on US goods, and he said that this is now the opportunity for companies and countries to bring their companies and factories to the United States. How feasible do you think that really is? Because it would seem to be a more expensive task to actually do that.
Absolutely. Look, in the short term, that is totally unrealistic, because essentially that would involve globalized companies that basically have bits of what they produced all over the world, disentangling all of that and moving to the United States. In the short term, that's simply not going to happen. in the medium to long term, it may well happen. But I'm not so sure that thinking about things in that way is actually up to date in terms of the technological revolution and its impact on employment. So, Trump may not be able to deliver what he claims he's going to deliver to his so-called redneck blue collar supporters in the states. So, yes, he's trying to do that, and some companies, some CEOs of important companies in Europe, as well as further afield, have made commitments that they will invest in the United States and so on. But it isn't that easy. It takes 3 to 5 to 7 years to relocate and to disentangle the consequences, if you like, of globalization, which has resulted in more integrated production lines, if you like, and goods and components of goods going across borders time and time again. So, in his simplified world, yes, it might be possible, but I don't think he, or perhaps they have and they don't care. Certainly, people like Navarro, frankly, don't care as to what the consequences on the minutiae of doing that actually entail.
And we may just see the consequences of that come the midterms next year. Professor Rizzuto, thanks so much for your analysis. Appreciate it.